Hey, Ben, welcome to Shared Narratives.
Hey Lily, thanks for having me. Excited for the conversation.
So excited to chat. I think we originally met in San Francisco, maybe around a decade ago. And so I
Yeah.
associate you with those really good years in San Francisco. And I'm also, I should disclose, a very small investor in your company, Recess, say that up front, which we'll talk about lots of topics to cover. But, I always start way back at the beginning. Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like? I know the answer to that question, but
Yeah.
tell folks because you grew up in one of the most idyllic places in America.
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in Laguna Beach, and kind of growing up, I was a surfer, and I was also into making movies, and kind of I was really, very much like a creative growing up. So into film, art, design, photography, and when I went to college, I thought I wanted to study film. Actually, I was smart enough to realize I wanted to get out of kind of the bubble of Southern California, and I ended up going to college in Boston at BU, originally thinking that I would study film. But I transferred into the kind of undergraduate business school, and kind of obviously that was a big shift in my life, which I can talk about later. But yeah, kind of growing up, I was in this it was a little beach town, so it was a great place to grow up.
Is it the type of place where people want to go back and raise kids, or is it the type of place that feels so small where people are like, I want to get out. I have to go see the rest of the world. Like, what was that like? Because I could see myself staying there forever, but I could also see myself being like, oh, I got to get to New York or somewhere else.
I'd say most people actually don't want to leave, or if they want to leave, they want to move to or go to LA for college or UC Santa Barbara or something like that. I was only one of the a few people in my high school or in my class at least to kind of go to school on the East Coast. Both my parents were from the East Coast. My dad grew up in Connecticut, my mom grew up on a farm in New Jersey, and so I do
Mm.
think I was probably I think that probably played a role in kind of wanting to leave and kind of have a different type of experience. But yeah, I think a lot of people kind of stay in Laguna or again don't go far, for college and then move back to the area because it is obviously very beautiful. But I do think it's very also kind of limiting. There's obviously a much bigger world out there, and so I'm very happy that kind of I left, but I'm also happy that I can go kind of back when I want and spend time in Laguna.
Super cool. Fast forwarding a bit to kind of present day, there's a major focus on wellness right now. McKinsey just put out a report saying it's a $2 trillion global market. Talk about the origin story of Recess, how you saw that wellness wave coming, and where Recess sits amidst it all.
Yeah. So I think like taking a step back. So I went to college in Boston. I took one class and kind of got exposed to. It was a business law class or an internet law class, and it was in 2009 or so. And that's when I kind of got exposed to what was happening in Silicon Valley. And I a lot of my friends in college were from New York City, and I thought I wanted to move to kind of New York. And I don't even know what I want. I was thinking about getting into real estate or finance or something like that. But as soon as I kind of really got exposed to what was happening in Silicon Valley at the time, I decided I wanted to move to San Francisco and join a startup. So, I joined a three-person startup out of college, that was building an influencer marketing platform for social media. So it was like the right idea at the wrong time. And, I got to think about how do you build a brand kind of in a social media driven world from the earliest days. And I also just kind of got hooked on startups, right? Joining a three-person company out of school, you get to wear a lot of hats. You're exposed to I was exposed to a lot of mistakes that were made. The company didn't end up working out, but I ultimately thought it was like a very kind of valuable experience. And I think from pretty early on in my early 20s, I knew I ultimately wanted to kind of start my own company. After that first company, I joined an ad tech company called AdRoll, where I was there from 15 people to like 600 people. So in that case, I saw, what a successful kind of high growth company was like. But I was always, again, one of these people that kind of no one knew what to do with. I was always kind of pushing the boundaries forward, like figuring out what was the next thing. Like at AdRoll, we started off as like a desktop advertising company. I was like, the world's shifting to mobile, and I became the head of mobile and kind of developed, our mobile strategy. but long story short, like after 4 years there, I decided it was time to kind of go out on my own, and this was in about kind of 2016. And smart enough to realize that I wasn't kind of the best person on the planet to go build like a software business, and that I wanted to do something kind of that leveraged my kind of creative sensibilities that I always knew kind of I had. And so I was focused on exploring ideas that were kind of consumer brands or consumer experiences. And the original kind of insight for what became Recess came in 2016, which is when it started to feel to me like we were entering this new period in history driven by technology, and it was going to leave kind of everyone stressed out and anxious. And it was right, during kind of the Trump kind of, Clinton election. And I remember when Trump won, I remember just thinking to myself, like, everything I thought about the world was wrong, right? I was like, how could this happen? We were told like this was not going to happen. And my ultimate conclusion is that like he was the symptom and not the disease, and that he was in some ways like the ultimate expression of anxiety. And that, so again, it had this thesis, going back to the recognition of this like shift in history that we were living through. But basically, then the future that we were entering, kind of people would be prioritizing their mental wellness and looking for new and healthier ways to relax and reduce stress, especially as compared to things like alcohol, even tobacco, or these kind of pre-existing but unhealthy forms of stress relief and relaxation. Shortly thereafter, I'd moved to New York City because I'd always been kind of inspired and invigorated by New York, and just again without like an idea to focus on yet, but with that like inkling of this like mental model of like where the world was going in the back of my head. And I started to see like CBD oil popping up, adaptogenic herbs, magnesium, nootropics, even THC, kind of this essentially this new class of functional ingredient and supplement form at the time. And my insight there was that like the common property of all these things was relaxation. Someone fundamentally was like consuming like a magnesium powder, a CBD oil, and smoking a joint, like all for the same reason, to relax. And so the light bulb moment was like Red Bull for relaxation. Like think of these new ingredients as like the inputs into this new class of products, both beverages and supplements, that would have this proposition of relaxation, just like caffeinated beverages, whether it's coffee or energy drinks, have this proposition of stimulation, and alcohol has this proposition of like intoxication. So I had this like mental model of stimulation, intoxication, relaxation. Basically, you have this like two massive categories, like again, caffeinated beverages and alcohol, that basically delivered like a feeling, and that there would basically be this third space that would emerge on the other side over the years to come, that would focus on delivering various propositions around relaxation. And so that was kind of the origin story. And I literally didn't know a single person that had ever worked in CPG. I never spent any time thinking about the space before I had the idea, which I actually think was like a competitive advantage. But yeah, that was the kind of the sequence of events that kind of led, me to ultimately focus on starting the company.
Super cool. We talked about this previously, is that consumers having a huge moment right now, especially in M&A between Poppy and Touchland and Rode, which bodes well for you down the road if you ever decide to pursue that path. One thing that's always funny to me, especially on the investor side of the table, is the idea that people feel consumer as a category goes in and out. Like, oh, consumer is in right now, or oh, enterprise is in right now. I always thought that was so silly, given that there's always consumers. People are always
Yeah.
consuming no matter the hype cycle or the economy. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the idea of consumer kind of goes in and out of fashion?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think it's in CPG in particular. It's in most cases you're building a company to sell to one of the large kind of conglomerates, and I think there's different kind of trends and different dynamics happening, like on the macroeconomic standpoint, as well as consumers trend standpoint, that kind of impact the sales of their portfolio. And I think they do come in. There are periods where they are more acquisitive or less acquisitive, like as they're trying to kind of shift their strategies. I think that's potentially one dynamic. I think I think like the way in which these companies have been built has fundamentally changed, right? With Recess, for example, we were one of the first like true digitally native kind of CPG brands, and certainly beverage brands that really kind of designed the brand as well as our distribution strategy to be truly omnichannel. I would always say like I wanted to kind of create the brand, validate the concept and build the awareness online in order to go offline. And so I do think like succeeding at building, one of these companies today kind of does require a new set of kind of capabilities than what I think the big, CPG conglomerates, traditionally had. I also think when you see these trends like, big macro shifts, like, consumers, prioritizing products that are low in sugar and calorie, kind of quote unquote better for you, or reducing their alcohol consumption, or seeking out, products that are high protein, high fiber. I mean, these are massive shifts in people's like consumption habits. And so, and I do think these shifts are kind of in some ways accelerating. I do question like how many new trends are there, right? That when you think about it, there's just not that many things that people are looking for, right? From just a jobs to be done framework. But I think there has been this significant shift that has occurred, over the past 10 years. And perhaps like social media has been an accelerant of that as people are like exposed to new ideas, more frequently and rapidly. And so, look, I haven't been in the space like long enough to have gone through all of these, these cycles, but I definitely think we're living through one right now. So
That last point is so interesting to me, the idea that consumers are really fickle, right? They can decide in a heartbeat whether they're on board with a trend or it's canceled and they're done with it, right? But as
yeah,
you know, to build any type of physical product takes many years from ideation to execution to launch. And by the time you launch it, maybe that hype cycle is over, right? And
yeah.
so I do appreciate that point about consumers being fickle.
Yeah.
I know that
Just
you're
on this
really
point, sorry, I just want to
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but like, I think like a trend like plant based, for example, that was an example of a trend that was way overhyped, right? I don't think it ever deserved the hype it received, right? I think this idea that like consumers, frankly, it was framed like as the primary value proposition for it was like this environmental like narrative, right? That like consuming plant-based milk and meat was like less bad for the environment than traditional meat and traditional milk. And I just don't think that's like a compelling enough value proposition for enough people. Right now, there are certainly people that like prefer plant milk to regular milk, right? But even still, like how big a market is that, and is that like truly that market's not going away? But like, how big will that get? I think is a question. But like, I would always say like, there's no scenario I can think of where people are going to be less stressed out in the future than they are today. There's just not possible, right? And from my perspective, right? And so I do think like in terms of like what we're building, I am confident that it's not a fad. I think it's in the early stages, and I think there's many of these trends that you can go to that some have come and gone, but when you really think about it, the question's like how enduring or big a market was that trend kind of relevant to. And so I do think it's like really thinking about like what is the job to be done consumers are hiring these products for, like what's the value proposition, and what is the world going to look like 10 years from now. And you can kind of work backwards from where will some of these markets ultimately go.
Totally. And you can't manufacture something that doesn't exist or that consumers don't want. And what I mean by that is like, remember oat milk? Like the rise of
Yeah,
oat milk came so fast. And then almost people came up with conspiracy theories or maybe real theories that it was pushed by, some other sort of competing brand or category or whatever.
yeah,
And then oat milk was bad for you. And then oat milk was canceled. And then people went back to real oat milk or real milk. And so, yeah, I think these cycles like go quickly. And I think consumers are smarter. They're asking questions now. They're not just saying, okay, the product's in front of me, it's popular, I'm going to buy it. They're thinking harder about what they want and whether it's good for them.
yeah, totally. I agree.
I know that company marketing and branding are really important to you. It's like a passion of yours, I would say. And I think company branding right now feels a lot more playful and experimental than it's ever been. I think companies are being a lot more casual in kind of the ways that they engage with consumers. Not all brands, of course, but some that I've seen. What do you think that says about the state of culture that companies realize the importance and necessity of being more casual than they used to be?
Yeah. Like think about the Recess brand, like, people I think oftentimes like refer to like the visual identity that we've created in the pastel colors and like the, our Instagram strategy and like personifying the cans in the early days, things like that. But I think the most important aspect of Recess is like the narrative of Recess. I'm a big believer in the kind of narrative driven brands. And so I like to start with the story first and then work backwards to like to the visual. And the story of Recess was very simple. It was like an antidote to modern times. Take a recess so they can feel kind of calm, cool, collected. And the entire like brand positioning was kind of focused on like delivering that message, consistently through everything, that we did. And then going to like the playful aspect, right? In terms of like what our kind of content strategy was and like our brand voice, I described it as kind of a social commentary on the millennial Gen Z existence. And so we were kind of creating content that kind of spoke to the crazy times that we were living through in this tongue-in-cheek way. So I do think brands today have to almost think of themselves as media companies, right? You have to kind of be able to create content and experiences on a day-to-day basis that kind of capture people's attention, while at the same time kind of delivering your kind of key messages and kind of value propositions so people understand what you stand for and how and when to use the product and what you're supposed to feel. And that make you, connect emotionally with the brand. And then ultimately, I'm a big believer in like basically the power of earned media. Like if you're not generating organic user generated content, like a lot of it on a daily basis, your brand's basically not connecting with people. And if people are not kind of sharing your content with their friends, it's also not, I think, I basically think sharing and like UGC are the most important metrics. And so again, it kind of, I'm answering your question in like reverse, but like, I think in order to create content like that, it has to be playful, right? And it has to essentially be a form of like branded entertainment. And so I think that is, I think that's why kind of the brands that break through today, again, are able to generate that word of mouth, are able to kind of create content that is entertaining and engaging. And ultimately that's what kind of creates this, this virality and kind of word of mouth and kind of network effects in the business, which I think are critical to ultimately, taking off. So.
Yeah, I want to talk about virality, but first I want to ask you on the topic of, content in media, how do you think about tapping into kind of the topical trends of the moment versus sticking to the evergreen campaigns and narratives that work? Because I think the former takes being really online, having people who are dedicated to figuring out what's moving online and how do you tap into it in a way that makes sense for you. It just requires almost like, humans to kind of
Yeah.
follow and be mindful of. But how do you think about that balance of like tapping into the trends versus the evergreen stuff that stays with you a long time?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are sometimes these things that happen in society and culture where it's like you want to comment on it and reference on it. And like you've often, and a lot of times these are obvious things where kind of every brand kind of piles on and does their take on, that moment. And so, yeah, I think, and what I would say is I think actually doing unexpected things is actually the way to break through in a very like noisy kind of environment today. And so, yes, you have to like follow the trends and comment on the things that kind of everyone else is commenting on. I think oftentimes, and I think in those moments, people like want to hear different takes from different brands and creators on something, that's happening. But I think what's actually more impactful is identifying, you know, topics, but even more importantly, kind of tactics and strategies that most other brands are not doing. And I think that's how you kind of, again, break through in a noisy world. Like, I think one of the most impactful things we did in the earliest days of Recess was this pop-up, like Recess IRL. And it was, I think, kind of ahead of like the moment in time where like kind of everyone was doing a pop-up, but we created this space in kind of lower Manhattan and Soho that was like designed to feel like you were walking into the feeling we wanted you to feel when you drank a Recess. And we'd host like 4 events a week for 6 months with different brand and creative partners. And it was just highly, highly impactful. And I think one of the reasons is because it was something that no other brand was really doing at the time. Right. So I think that was a good example. I think our content, our original Instagram strategy was, it was not following any trend. It was really kind of groundbreaking in some ways. And I think as a result, it kind of broke through. And now, I think there's an argument that it's probably a little tired, and we're in this phase of like, going through this brand transformation. And there's many other examples of, things like that we've done kind of over the years. But I think I'm always trying to think about like, what are, again, things that we are well positioned to do that other brands are not doing. And I do think those are the types of things that ultimately kind of break through and add the most kind of value.
Makes sense. I want to go back for a second to the topic of virality, because I think there's a lot of pressure to go viral, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
marketers believe you should build through the lens of virality potential. And so I'm curious if you think virality can be manufactured. And I'll tell you my take on it after. I actually have an essay on Substack. If
Mm-hmm.
people listening have not subscribed to the Shared Narrative Substack, please do. But tell me your take. Do you think virality can be manufactured?
I think virality is almost like too narrow and strong a term. Like, I had this principle. There's actually a Keith Rabois like lecture, like he's a Silicon Valley like VC that I saw in the early days of Recess. And at this point, it was that every business has like a key metric or key equation to optimize for outside of revenue and profit. And I think the key is to, I look at your unique dynamics in the space and the business model, that you're developing, and identify what that is. And for beverage, I was convinced that the key metric is how can you generate the most amount of impactful brand impressions for the least amount of money. And so I've optimized everything around the business with that in mind. And so you think about like, what are ways you can generate impressions for, very cost effectively? Well, it's like, again, creating content that people kind of engage with and share with their friends. You're generating kind of earned media, that way. Press is another thing. I had this principle of like, we've been very omnichannel from the very beginning. We're about 50% e-com, 50% retail, and that's shifting more towards retail now. But the way I like manage the e-commerce business was to be basically profitable, contribution margin profitable. And what that effectively allows us to do is spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month on digital ads through TikTok and Meta and Google, where we're measuring them on an ROI basis against the e-com business. So they're essentially free impressions. So we're generating tens of millions of free impressions every month that, drive the e-commerce business, but also benefit retail and kind of create brand awareness, for the overall, Recess brand. I think the Recess platform is another example of that. Where basically we have product lines in multiple parts of a store. So when people are, walking around a store, they're being exposed to the brand in different places. And whether they're buying it or not, those are free impressions. And I think there's a lot of little decisions like that we've done that ultimately add up to, you can call it, it's a different form of virality, but they're basic. What is virality? It's basically about generating lots of impressions, right? And so I think there's a number of ways you can kind of come at that. And so I look at like what we have now is this kind of engine that's been built. And we're not even doing brand marketing yet, basically, in the grand scheme of things. We've done nothing with celebrity. We've done nothing out of home. We've done nothing with television. There's a lot of things for us to do, like still to do next, that we're now at a scale where it makes sense, where we can kind of pour gas into the fire that we've created or into the engine that we've created, and it's just going to, spin faster. And so that's kind of how I'd come out that question. I know it wasn't exactly what you're looking for, but I think it is, long story short, I do think it is hard to manufacture virality, right? And so I think, how can you accomplish what virality does in different ways, right? And I think it's doing a lot of different things that all are fundamentally about, again, generating impressions and earned media. So
And brand awareness, right? Like you
yeah,
can
brand awareness.
almost, yeah, like replace virality with brand awareness, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I agree with your take. I think in a world where AI is embedded in every single input and every single output, there will almost be like individualized pockets of virality. And so, what may be viral in my little world may not be viral in your world.
yeah,
And so, I think that that enables everyone
mm,
to feel like they're the first to see
mm,
something, the first to be a, the tastemaker of a new place or a trend spotter or like some, new product. And everyone wants to feel like that, right? But once a product does go viral or a video or whatever, people are like, oh, everyone's seen it. It's kind of old news. I think the idea that everyone wants to be the first at something is kind of powerful. And maybe AI, unintentionally will get us there because
yeah,
there will just be so much content. And
mm,
my viral videos will look very different from your viral videos.
yeah. No, I think that's right. Like obviously, each of the feeds were all content feeds that we're consuming on all of these apps. They're all personalized, right? So they're going to be different. But I kind of reject the premise that a brand requires like one viral moment to like get off the ground. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a lot of little things that come together that that work together to create quote unquote kind of again this a flywheel. I prefer the term like I always would say the recess flywheel. And like yes, we've created some content that's gone quote unquote viral, right? But it's a very small percentage of the overall number of pieces of content that we've created over 6 years, right? But I think they all kind of contribute, to that idea. And now as we like develop new types of content and lean more into kind of branded entertainment and are able to work with bigger talent and things like that, I think it increases the probability that those things will go quote unquote viral. So yeah.
I agree with you. One thing that's somewhat related is I want to talk about engaging with consumers, which feels really important right now for brands to talk to their customers, not just, when they're negative and they leave a negative comment and you reply to them, but making them feel brought along almost in the company building and
Hmm.
enabling them to give feedback about what products they like, what products they want to see, maybe what products they don't like. How do you think about doing that at Recess, really engaging with customers and hearing from them and almost facilitating bi-directional conversation, which I know it sounds ridiculous, but I think
Yeah.
it's kind of the future.
Yeah. Look, I would say I agree with your point that like consumers like to feel like they're early to something, and then as the company scales, like they feel like they've played a role in that, right? And so, like for example, as we went from like a direct consumer brand to entering kind of regional grocers to going national at Target to now Kroger and Publix and Trader Joe's, like I think a lot of people like feel like they feel cool because they were like in on the brand before it got big, quote unquote, and right. And so I think that's one aspect that I would agree with you on. That I do think it's important to like have people feel like they played a role in a company's growth. I would say for us, it's we've not done a lot of like focus groups, or we've done some surveys and things like that, but I'd say it's a lot been like, frankly, like not following my intuition. It's listening to the customer. Like I will say, I've seen, this is not a joke, every piece of user generated content that someone's posted about Recess, like ever, right? On Instagram, right? And I look, I'm like, when you get, exposed to, call it 100 stories a day, tag stories a day, for 6 years, and then all the Amazon reviews, you kind of pattern match. You can kind of see, you know, what are the different ways people are, consuming Recess? What are they feeling? What are they looking for? What do they like? What do they not like? I don't think it was like truly bi-directional, but people are telling you what they think and what they feel themselves. Right now, this wasn't as like conversational as it might could have been, but I do think there's an element of like with Recess where if you would have asked people when I created the product, like, do you want a product, a beverage to help you relax? They wouldn't have said yes because they didn't even like think of that, right?
Hmm.
Right. And so I do think there's like the right balance to kind of strike there, and say now that we're getting bigger, we are doing some, like we're going through like a flavor optimization exercise right now. Like, are there tweaks to the flavor on the recessed mood line, that we can make that, as we move into like Walmart and Costco and are exposed to like an even more mainstream consumer, are there adjustments that we can make that don't like alienate the early customer base, but also make the product, even more desirable for, a more mainstream, audience. And so we are doing like a focus group, with that. So I think as we mature, I think there's more, a lot more we can do around kind of consumer insights and kind of two-way conversations. But for the past 6 years, it's been, again, like my intuition, and then, but importantly, like listening to what the customers were saying, but not in a way that was like a conversation, right? It was more, again, looking at just, organic testimonials and reviews and kind of coming to my own conclusions about, optimizations to make on flavor or function or brand positioning or, a future product line like the mocktails, which we created. So
Cool. On the topic of both talking to customers and also tapping into kind of the flavor of the day, what do you think about brands taking a stance on either current events or political issues? Do you think that consumers care, or do you think it's performative? And where do you stand as a founder?
yeah, I mean, I always stood, mostly because I'm like pretty politically independent, but also because the whole premise of Recess was to help you escape reality. So to like
Mm,
enter the conversations of today, especially around politics or anything where there's, there's a controversial issue, I think is doesn't align to our mission, right? Which was to help people kind of, again, relax and kind of escape reality. I think there's other brands that can decide to kind of play a role in things. And I think it does depend on the issue. But I'd say for Recess and for myself in particular, I don't think it's in our interest or is like why we exist, right?
mm.
To kind of insert ourselves into, any kind of political or controversial kind of discussions. So, but I do think for some brands, I think that I think that can be a part of their mission, and I think it
Mm.
can, be net positive for their business. So I'm not going to take like say that doesn't make sense for anyone or any business, but I think in our case, I don't think it makes sense.
I get that. I think that makes sense for you. I think one area that you've seen some consumer companies especially talk about is just the impact of tariffs, right? Because that feels really relevant. Obviously,
Hmm.
consumers are thinking about it and reading about it on the news. But then if it does, appear in their
Yeah,
pricing, and it appears in delays, and it appears
yeah,
in, after the thought, like just, yeah, all kinds of consequences for consumers. I feel like that's
yeah,
a safer place to tap
yeah,
into what's happening, and also be transparent and help people think about, how you make decisions. Not saying you have to do it, but that
yeah.
feels like one area
I
that's fair
agree. I
game.
agree with that. I agree
Yeah.
with that. Like it hasn't significantly negatively impacted us yet. Like it still could theoretically. And if we did have to like raise prices for some reason, I do think we would want to explain why we did that. So I do think that's a good example of an issue where I think would be fine to kind of communicate the what's going on behind the scenes.
One thing I wanted to ask you, I'm curious if you have seen on, I think maybe TikTok, is what do you think about brands trying to humanize themselves or sort of match their products with personality types? Have you seen these new things like girl water or like mom beer? No?
Mm. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, I do think there's something with like brands. I think it's important to feel like you want your brand to feel timeless, like it could
Mm,
exist in like 30 years. I think a valuable brand, almost like by definition, like is one that will exist and still connect, with hopefully a lot more consumers 10 years from 10 years in the future than they do today. And I do find a lot of brands to feel to not be timeless, right? And
mm,
like they may be very good at like connecting in the present moment. Like does the name or does like the brand positioning or the marketing tactics will it get kind of old and tired, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, like, will that negatively impact kind of the future potential growth of the business? And so, yeah, I think it's a thing. I would say most of the time it feels like I don't know how like viable like those strategies will be for the long term. But I could see them kind of, having a period of kind of virality to them.
Mm-hmm. I don't know enough about these companies. I just want to hear what you
Yeah.
thought, but it feels like they're trying to be inclusive, right, into these groups or pockets of society that may not otherwise be associated with, beer or whatever it is. But then it ends up being kind of exclusive, right? Because if you use those terms in the branding and the nomenclature, you are kind of isolating everybody else. So it's like meant to be inclusive, but ends up being kind of, I don't know,
Yeah.
isolating.
I, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Yeah. On the topic of brands, what are your favorite brands or companies outside of Recess that you look at and you think, oh, wow, they do a great job with their narrative or their visual identity or how they engage with customers?
That's a good question. I mean, I've always been I did model Recess off of like Red Bull in some ways in terms of like, I'd always say like when, we were marketing the solution, not the ingredient. I'd always say like, I've never heard anyone call Red Bull a caffeine company. It was an energy company. Just like I've always rejected the premise that we were a CBD company in the early days. And now CBD is less than 3% of our sales. Right. And so like, but for years, people were referring to us, as a CBD beverage company. Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
I always looked at like Red Bull from, again, a brand positioning standpoint. And then I'd always say Red Bull's a media company that monetizes through selling cans, right? Yeah, I talked earlier about like brands as kind of media companies. Like, obviously, I thought what they did with their content strategy, was very inspiring to Recess. Like, they focused on integrating into, uh, kind of extreme sports, right? To kind of, and developing essentially an entire content business and talent business around extreme sports in order to kind of create the association with having a Red Bull and getting stimulated.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like very inspiring to, what we've done at Recess. I think Gatorade is another example, in the beverage space around, um, basically focused on like professional athletics, in order to kind of, market a sports drink. And then they've ultimately kind of built this, platform, a branded platform. They have water, they have, gummies, they have protein bars, they have shots, they have a million different products all under the Gatorade brand
Mm-hmm.
that have this kind of consistent value proposition under like sports performance,
Mm.
basically. And so, those are two kind of beverage brands that really kind of inspired, my thinking, that led to the development of like our kind of brand strategy. So yeah, I think those are two good examples.
Cool. I want to zoom out a little bit to you as a person because one of the goals with this podcast is to really get to know kind of the person behind the company or the person behind the career. So I'm curious now that you've got some years under your belt building Recess, like what have you learned about yourself from building a company and a team even?
Yeah.
What has surprised you?
Um, I think I was able to like follow my intuition in order to like allow me to focus, into building a team and ultimately a set of investors and partners that were very complementary to kind of what, my strengths were, which is, I think, ultimately it's around like, I think I'm good at like kind of connecting dots. And so I do reflect backwards and where like at the time I made some decisions again around investors, around kind of the team I built, the team I kept together, et cetera. And yeah, I think I had like the self-awareness to know the things that, I was going to be good at and the things that I would not be good at. And as a result, I had to kind of, bring on kind of, again, complementary partners too. Um, I think the fact that like, a lot of my close friends, right? I think we're all like generally like curious people that have a lot of, different intellectual interests. And I think, that is a benefit to I think what I've done with Recess, and that I think I almost approached it more from like a Silicon Valley perspective and like took a lot of like business principles that I think are more like kind of Silicon Valley kind of principles and applied them to a CPG company, which I think was ultimately kind of this was required in this unique situation that I've been kind of operating in. And so I do think to like navigate what we did over the past 6 years, you needed someone with like my unique, again, combination of strengths. I think a traditional like beverage founder, like someone from like the CPG industry, probably wouldn't have been able to like think make the unexpected moves that we did that ultimately kind of paid off. And so ultimately, I think like my biggest lesson is just like continue to follow my intuition. And I think I'm relatively like self-aware and again know my strengths and weaknesses, and so I want to continue doing that. And so one of the things, I think that's one thing I've learned, and I think is very important for founders. I think like founder market fit is like very, very important and under discussed. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
always against this like entrepreneurship for sport idea where you can just like, I'm just going to come up with any idea in any market and think like I'm going to be the right person to go build this business. I think that most of the time is like a recipe for disaster, right? Where like the second it gets hard, like you're just going to like, you don't enjoy it and you're just going to like kind of give up, right? And just want to quit. And there was a lot of times during recess where it was just like, it was difficult, right? And I think if I wouldn't have felt like I was like the right person to like persevere or like trust the instincts for like how I thought about the space, which were very, again, counterintuitive, at the time, but have again proven to be true. Like I would have just kind of given up. And so I do think, just having that self awareness and following your gut and your intuition, I think it is critical to life in general, but certainly kind of building a business.
Yeah, I appreciate the point about self awareness, but also founder market fit, because there's this concept of earned secrets, the idea that
Mm,
you can either have like institutional knowledge in a category or you can have intuition earned secrets, right? And so you have to know or believe or feel so strongly about something that sets you apart, that enables you to really work hard at something and build an enduring company. But as you said, if you come at it from the outside, I actually think you said this at the very beginning of the podcast, you probably weren't a good fit to start an enterprise company. And
yeah,
just having that type of knowledge up front is really important, right? You can do it because
yeah,
it's trendy, but you should do it because it's a good fit for you and you're willing to kind of stick with it for the long haul, which I think is hard.
yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
imagine you feel the same way in terms of like you felt this connection to like writing and kind of creating content, and it sounds like you're really doubling down on kind of shared narratives and again the podcast and the Substack. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think that I'll tell you, I don't know if I said this to you before, is like, I think that there's a lot of white space. If you look at a spectrum of Instagram influencers on one side and then legacy media
Hmm.
on the other, of which you'd put like CNN and the magazine industry and even like television. I think there's all this white space in the middle for content from people that are trusted, that are thoughtful, that are a little playful, that can talk to you in really approachable ways. And I think we're seeing just this massive rise of content creators who do Substack or podcast or, other forms of new media. And it's cool to be a part of.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
couple
And
last
yeah,
questions. Yeah,
right.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I do think all of these worlds are like colliding and connecting in ways they didn't previously. Like in the past, like Silicon Valley was in its own like place, and obviously now it's like intersecting with geopolitics and politics in a
Mm-hmm.
significant
Yes.
way. I think CPG is very tech driven increasingly from a distribution. Every business is obviously being influenced by technology, like creative culture and fashion and design is intersecting with all these things. And so I think someone that can like straddle all of those is, I think, important. In the previous, I think things were more siloed, and I think you're an example of someone that can do that very effectively.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I think a lot about the election, which, not to get political, but a lot of people after the fact called it a podcast election, right? But
Yeah,
beforehand, no one was really taking podcasts seriously. They're like, who listens to them? Does anyone really trust them? Does anyone really, take it seriously? And then, yeah, like who knows if it actually moved the needle? but it was a factor. And people look to these I hate to use the word alternative, but like alternative forms of media and
Hmm.
content that just people didn't see coming. And now people are taking it seriously. But it's like, oh, are they too late to the party? But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Um, Going back to you personally, who has been outside of work and company building? What do you do for fun or to relax?
I recently, let's see, I love music, so I see a lot of concerts. I recently started taking tennis lessons, do yoga, read a decent amount, listen to a lot of podcasts, travel when I can. I love to cook. I love to host. Um, so I'd say those are, that's how I spend most of my time when I'm not working. But I'm also a big
Nice.
believer in like kind of work life integration. Especially as a founder. And it's great. I mean, all my friends are investors. One of my best friends is on the board. Like I'm partners with a lot of my friends' companies in different ways. I've become very close friends with different agent, like the guys that I built the brand with. It wasn't we were their first client. Now they're best friends with me. So again, I do believe in like kind of work life integration and all of those things. Whether we're going to concerts together, doing a dinner party together, sometimes we're talking about work, sometimes not. But I do think all these things, it doesn't, if that's the case, it doesn't almost feel like work, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's can be, a good thing.
Definitely. I know lots of your friends. And as you said before, everyone is super curious and always like tinkering and thinking of new ideas. And I know you think about a lot of ideas. I think at one point you were thinking about starting a hotel. I can't remember if that was the
Hmm.
pre-recess days, but
Yeah.
where do you see white space right now if you were going to start something else? Like what categories are interesting to you right now?
Good question. I mean, I do think CPG is very crowded. Like, I think, when I started working on Recess, like, all my friends thought I was crazy for like going into CPG and doing a beverage company. And I think it wasn't just us, like, but you know, I think it became like a lot of spaces in CPG became very crowded very quickly. So I wouldn't say, I mean, there's certainly opportunity, but I do think it does feel crowded to me. It feels like very difficult to kind of break through. I think like consumer and internet companies feel like a white space. I do feel like there's like a big opportunity in kind of consumer digital experiences, like a new digital experiences, leveraging AI, kind of new social networks. Like, I think there's stuff. I think there's stuff there. I think there's a lot happening in like, you know, in real life kind of experiences, like as people feel like they're spending way too much time, connected, on their phones and, online. They want to get out into the real world and do kind of various activities, right? And I think that's why you see things like golf and pickleball and paddle and running clubs and, different kind of communities taking off. And so I do think that's going to continue to kind of grow dramatically. And I think there are certainly some big opportunities, there. And going back to like you asked about the idea, the hotel concept, and that's correct. The idea I had before Recess was like Soho House meets a high-end hostel, like targeted at like the kind of the bi-coastal like WeWork crowd. But I was a big believer in like third spaces, and it kind of blew my mind. Like, why was there only one quote unquote Soho House, and now social clubs have like really grown dramatically. And so I think my instincts around that general space were right. But I do think it was like an example of like, okay, it might be a good idea, but you're fundamentally in the real estate development business and like, the restaurant business or so. Like, and so you can call all these things whatever you want, but fundamentally, like they're making money selling food and alcohol and, like, these. So I do think it's something to always remember as you trying to develop innovative concepts. At the end of the day, a lot of them are just like restaurants, right? At the end, that's how they make their money,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, yeah, I think again, digital consumer experiences in real life kind of communities and around interests and activities feels like
Mm-hmm.
big opportunities that will continue to develop.
Totally. If I was building a company, it would be in bridging the online and offline worlds. I don't think I could build like a balance sheet business that
Yeah,
requires a lot of capital and real estate and all that. But
yeah,
it's fun to think
totally.
about, super fun to think about. Cool. Ben, thank you for doing this with me. Where can people find you and learn more about you and shop Recess?
Yeah. Well, for Recess, our website's takearecess.com, and just go on Amazon and search for Recess. We have all our products are on Amazon, and we're in Target and Kroger and Publix and Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, etc. For me, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at BWITTE, B Witty, or LinkedIn. So, yeah, thanks so
Awesome.
much for
Thanks,
having me
Ben.
on.